You have a water. This is yours. Okay, we're going to get started. Hi, I'm John Enright. Pleased to introduce is this our fourth lecture? Fourth lecture of the semester. Joshua Prince-Ramus, principal of Rex from New York City. Most of you should know his work. He practiced collaboratively with Rem Koolhaas and OMA through much of the 90s and early aughts. There were some carryover projects. He was instrumental and part of the team, and in fact, Rex claims the Seattle Public Library as one of their projects, along with OMA, as well as probably the more well-known Wyly Theater in Dallas, and the Vakko Fashion Center in Istanbul, Turkey, as well as a series of other projects that I'm sure we'll see tonight. Joshua is I've just met him, although we think we met at a party in 1992, which is quite possible, but we both vaguely remember, but there's other people that say we met, so we're trusting their judgment. I believe he's an extremely direct and focused architect. He will, I believe, of course, your lecture is titled Agency, and he's lectured on that, and you can see some of that online. He believes, I think, that architects need to reinvent their relevance, and I think he's going to argue for that tonight. How he does that will be interesting to see. I think he embraces convention. In that way, I think he's maybe thinking of invention through convention, or convention turned into invention, or maybe unconventional knowledge of conventions equals innovation. I have one slide, actually two. This is, as we all know, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, Sergio Leone, 1966. The Italian's better, Il Buono, Il Brutto, Il Cattivo. And in this famous scene at the end of the movie, this is a kind of Mexican standoff, three gunslingers. Of course, we have Clint Eastwood, Lee Van Cleef, and Eli Wallach. Clint being our hero in the movie. Clint maybe represents architects in this argument, I believe. Lee Van Cleef, Angel Eyes, he's the guy in the middle. Maybe he represents pure engineering, kind of cold-blooded and deadly, single purpose. Maybe architecture's functionality and convention. And then, of course, my favorite, Tuco, the non sequitur, the unknown, maybe risk, maybe they're a client. This kind of triad, of course, you can assign different kind of personas to. The famous one being typical architecture contracts, which also Joshua speaks of, and I think it's super interesting that he calls to order all architects to understand contracts and how contracts are so important. But the typical contract language of, well, you have scope, which is how much the architect actually does. You have quality of the thing, which is part of scope. You have money, and you have time. So the typical saying goes, you can take one, but I get two. So if a client takes money, you're not getting paid much, but then it's going to take a long time, and maybe the quality's down. The problem with architects, of course, we never give up quality, so we're usually not making money and still doing quality. Or you can say, well, you take quality, and I'll take the money and time. So I can do it fast, and you'll pay me for that, but the quality won't be there. In any case, this kind of triad, of course, in the movie, to win this kind of fight, where you're in the movie, in the middle of the ring, is a rock, and the rock has the name of a tombstone where the gold is. And so Clint Eastwood's character said, let's shoot it out. and whoever wins will see the name and get the gold. So this is architecture in the middle. Now, in a fair fight, this is, of course, a kind of well-known mathematical game where you are trying to figure out who to shoot first, and then also to find out who's going to shoot you. So if you find out who's going to shoot you, you can shoot them first or try to outdraw them. But of course, in the movie, it's not a fair fight, and Clint Eastwood has taken the bullets out of Tuco's gun. So he knows already that he's going to shoot engineering and function, and he's already tricked the user, the client, and he wins. So I think this is what Joshua is getting at in terms of strategy. So please join me in welcoming the gunslinger of convention turned into agency, Joshua Prince-Ramus.
First, thank you very much for having me. My career actually, I can't say it began in LA, but it began in Rotterdam, but the first project I worked on for almost 3.5 years was in LA. And so I was coming here maybe three times a month for almost 3.5 years. So I have a very kind of fond memory of the place. This is how I perceive of LA. And it's within that context that I hope to kind of rally you up a little bit. I'm going to talk about agency tonight. And first I'm going to give you a little bit of a spiel, a shtick. You can buy it or not. I'm going to try to justify it through 3 built projects. Several of them you probably know. And then I'm going to show recent work with the hope of having you believe that if the first stuff worked, the recent stuff might also. So with that, I'm going to begin with what actually turns us on. What turns us on as a practice, and I say it all the time, we think that architecture should do things, not simply represent things. Now, to be clear, we totally believe in beauty. But as we also like to say, we're not dumb enough to talk about beauty in public. Rather, what we focus on is maximizing beauty, form, and anything else at our disposal, i.e. maximizing performance, calibrated to each project. And that we call agency. Now, if you want to have architecture be an agent, how do you do it? Well, I would hope you would not do it this way, right? If you were to roll yourself up in a 60-foot Spartan, you would not get through the gates of Troy. If your objective is to get whatever your agenda is through the gates of Troy, you should roll up something that you believe actually the gates of Troy want, in this case, a Trojan horse. I'm not exactly sure why a Trojan horse was something that they wanted through the gates of Troy, but they did. And then once through the gates of Troy, you can deliver whatever it is you want. Now, I hope that when you choose to deliver something, if you use this process, that you deliver something that is benign, deliver maidens. Now, this is not necessarily the methodology one must use in order to deliver agency. You can also, frankly, use the same thing if your objective is completely formal-based. Nonetheless, that is the process that I'm going to describe tonight, and it can be summed up by this one diagram, which is the belief that if we are very good at what we do, if we can define a manifestation of our agency, what we want to achieve, and we fully understand the constraints, and we understand that they are both, frankly, malleable, including the constraints, that we should be able to find a version of the agent that can actually pass seamlessly through the constraints instead of smacking up against it and what comes out as some kind of bastardized second. The process that we go through is banal. Okay? The first thing we do with our clients, and I'm honest to God, this is what we do on every single project. Probably is boring to be in our office. The first thing we do is we identify what the core issues are. You're a tough crowd. We identify what the core issues are with our client, and then this is the important thing. We take joint positions with them. The idea of taking a joint position with a client is actually to empower both of you. If you clearly agree that this is what the thing must do, and you put something before them that doesn't do it, they are now empowered to say, hey, this is what we agreed to do, this isn't it. You have to go back and now you have to redesign at your own cost. But it also empowers you, because you can go back to them and say, hey, we agreed to do this does that, what's the problem? If you want me to redesign, it's at your cost, and maybe actually the issue is we've just discovered that what you thought you wanted isn't what you want, and that is going to be at your cost. Only after taking joint positions, then we allow ourselves to start doing, idle hands of the devil, to start playing, right? We resist this idea that I think is very endemic in our profession, which is that architects are chomping at the bit to start. Clients want them to start, and they go, and they go, and they go, and it's not until about a year into the process that the client starts to realize what it is that they've actually starting to get. And then there's sort of, we call it come to Jesus moment, and everything falls apart. Well, if you've taken joint positions with them, you avoid that process. Once you have those joint positions, create architectural manifestations, the key is what we like to call critical naivete. And this means to eschew convention. Now, to be clear, eschew convention does not mean to refuse convention. It just says don't fall into it right away. And then to doggedly explore the particular issues at hand, and maybe you discover that the convention is correct. Maybe you discover that you need to reinvent the convention, or maybe you need to discover that you must reject the convention. Nonetheless, that critical naivete is what we have discovered allows us always to achieve something that performs to a very, very high degree, but also because it is such a specific, tailored solution to just that one scenario, that one site, that one economics, that one political situation, that one client, it creates something that's a one-off that you've never seen before. And to date, it hasn't yet, at least from our opinion, created something that's pig shit ugly. There's a lot more to dig into that. As we work, of course, there are moments in which things will perform equally, and so then we do make a subjective decision, and at that moment, that is in fact where beauty is starting to be inserted. So I don't want you to believe that this is an argument for form follows function. It's not. Everything I'm going to show you we think is beautiful. You may not. That's fine. That's precisely why I say we're not dumb enough to talk about in public. The first project I'm going to talk about is the genesis of this process, the Seattle Central Library. When we started the project in 1999, we were confronted with an extremely unique situation. Seattle was at the absolute peak of the tech bubble, and the city had just passed a $198.6 million bond measure for public libraries, not just for this building. This was 111.9. So there was incredible mandate for the building, and yet no one could agree what it should be. And in particular, people like Microsoft and Real Networks, who are currently investing billions in trying to get the book to go away, were saying, well, why are we doing this project at all? And so with the client, we realized we had better be able to tell the public why we made certain decisions. And that's how this idea of core issues and then taking positions arose, precisely out of the fear of this project. So I'm going to describe for each one of the projects I'm going to show, I'm going to try and describe what the issue is, the position, and then what the manifestation was. For this project, there were really two basic issues and two basic positions. The first issue was this. In 1999, we were seeing a simultaneous explosion of responsibilities. One was an explosion of information, and one was an explosion of social responsibility. Now, this is something that I think today, librarians, people who use libraries, we sort of expect it. You know, the notion of, quote, the living room is something that everyone sort of anticipates with a public library. In 1999, that was not the case. In fact, in 1999, everyone said the explosion of information, that is the public library's mandate, and the social responsibility isn't. Well, that's a very, very dangerous attitude to have in 1999, and when we saw all the architect and owner teams doing the same thing with their libraries. They didn't really know what was going to happen, and so they were hedging their bets, and they were using a kind of a standard high modernist notion of flexibility. One size fits all. We can put anything anywhere. Well, if you have two explosions going on and you only believe in one, chances are you're going to let that one push the other one out of the building when that one starts to need space and make other demands. And so we're seeing one part of the responsibility of the library eat the other one alive. And so we proposed, and this was the position, to compartmentalize, to take those things whose evolutions we could predict, at least the spectrum of which we thought we could predict their future, and we put them into a box. And in that box, we solved only that one problem. And that box had a very specific material language, structural language, MEP, circulation, form of flexibility, everything tailored to that one thing. And for the things whose evolutions we couldn't predict, such as a reading room, we simply put them on the box, onto the rooftop of the box. So at least in the environment that we created, it had capital A architecture, had experience, even if you couldn't actually define precisely how that space was going to be used, because it was going to change constantly. When we presented that as the underlying, or one of the two underlying positions of the project, the board actually resisted it, precisely because they said, hey, wait, information explosion, that's our mandate, social responsibility is not. What was interesting is that one of the other things we were doing at the same time was an analysis of their brief. And the thing on the left, that was their program. The width of that bar chart is the width of the site, that's to scale. And what you're seeing on the left is the program that they had developed for 10 years in the organization that they had given it to us. And the next bar chart is what we said back to them. Right? To be clear, I don't think it's the role of an architect to assume knowledge about something their client does as a profession. But it is the role of the architect to act as a kind of mirror, to be kind of like an architectural psychiatrist, to say, hey, you say one thing, but you're doing another. And there's a problem there if we attempt to actually manifest the thing that you say you're doing when in fact you're doing the other. The reason I raise this is that this, if you dissect this, was already only 1/3 information explosion and 2/3 social responsibility explosion. Right, so when we showed that chart back to the library, they kind of said, look, you need to go away. Right? We don't know how to process that. And when we came back, they said, okay, we understand. The issue is not that you're asking us to change. The issue is that we have already changed. And now we need to design a library anew with a new concept. And so with that, they allowed us to recombine everything into its cardinal positions and divide it into 5 boxes into which we solved only one problem, and their rooftops, the things whose evolutions we couldn't really predict. And after creating this, and this is literally a section of the building, so that was 4th Avenue, in between 4th and 5th, that's 5th Avenue, and so forth. And all the relationships were things that we agreed how the building must correspond to itself. And we asked the library board, and in fact the head of the library union, to sign an Excel spreadsheet that verified that diagram. And then we went away. We went away for about 3 weeks, and we kept trying to design. And every time we tried to design, we couldn't do that. And so probably, I think this idea of build the diagram has a lot of negative connotations these days. But in fact, if the diagram is incredibly specific, you would be stupid not to build the diagram. And we literally built the diagram. There's one box underneath, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, and then 4 in between spaces, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now the diagram, however, that we built was still very generic. Right? We knew the books were going to go in here, but we didn't know how to solve it yet. We knew that the meeting rooms were going to go in here, but we didn't know how to solve it yet. And so the underlying conceptual structure was incredibly robust and could take enormous amount of impact from both the client and from the public while still retaining its clarity. And then at some point we skinned it. If you knew anything about the project, that was a seismic skin, basically externalizing the building structure, and that was it when it was finally built. Now when we pulled this out of the box, you can imagine, particularly when Frank Gehry's EMP was getting built right down the street at the same time, the public was a little bit freaked out. They said, we're committing $111.9 million of taxpayer money, and what we don't need is something that honors the architect's ego. We need public library, and this isn't it. What was amazing is that we didn't actually have to defend it. The people who defended it were the librarians. And you can imagine that it's very, very difficult for someone in the Seattle Times in the op-ed department to make a scathing article about this idea if, when they go to interview the librarians say, you know what, you're right, I have no idea what that thing is. Never seen anything like it. But it is exactly everything that we agreed it must do, and in precisely the place it must be. And so we told them they must build it. It's the end of the discussion. And so that is maybe the best example I can give you of the Trojan horse. The idea of having such a clear idea of what your agenda is that when it starts to meet constraints, it's already predetermined to move straight through those constraints. By the way, we always show this elevation also. This is called PIG. We named it that. Because anytime that we attempted to aestheticize the thing, it actually started to lose its clarity. So at some point we simply accepted, like the gap between Lauren Hutton's teeth, the building would have to have something awkward. And if it didn't have something awkward, it probably wouldn't create the friction in order to be beautiful. So going from the base of the building up, this was one of the first in-between space, then through the auditorium up to the second in-between space, bypassing the staff floor. A box, this was the meeting box, the mixing chamber, the main information area, moving up through an escalator through the book spiral and up to the reading room. So you get the sense that within one building, there was actually sort of 5 different buildings connected by almost like an urban park, but it's actually interiorized. Seattle is rainy. There are no exterior public parks except one, and it happens to be in front of a federal courthouse, and so you're not allowed to use it. So the idea that we would actually create this interiorized park was central to the idea. Now the second issue was technology. At that time, we couldn't yet even predict how far it would go, but it was still the same problem, the ubiquitousness of technology and the fact that information could be accessed anywhere in your hand, and then potentially even in your glasses, and soon, I imagine, embedded into our own skin. Well, if information can be accessed anywhere, why would you get into a car, drive downtown, fight traffic, park, pay for parking to go to a central library? You'd be crazy. In short, maybe Microsoft was right. Why build a central library? And the answer was curation. If today you type in Finnegan's Wake and you get 1.2 million hits, how do you know what you should actually look at on the internet relative to Finnegan's Wake? Well, the way that you will know in a central library are the librarians, i.e. invert the system, make the building not about access to information, but actually curation of information, and take these wonderful people who actually almost all have PhDs in things like chemistry and applied and computational mathematics, and let them use that experience instead of being belittled as docents. So with that in mind, we wanted to go from a system in which librarians were sort of spread all out as docents in little fiefdoms and be able to create a kind of a nexus of information in which the librarians could dogpile you, right? As you walked in and you had an idea about Descartes, you didn't know if it should be in social theory, hardcore philosophy, mathematics. You could actually get librarians from all 3 specialties, dogpile you, and actually start to work with you and realize, in fact, that isn't even what you wanted at all. It was something else. We wanted that interdisciplinary node. But in order to do that, we had to take the librarians out of this configuration, i.e. we had to get them out of this. This is what we call the Trail of Tears. Libraries, you walk into them, you find your book through some form of confusing system, you relate that book to a Dewey Decimal number, you get that Dewey Decimal number, you go to something like this, you relate that Dewey Decimal number to something that's like literature, humanities, or fiction, and to be honest, to this day, I still don't know the difference between literature, humanities, and fiction. You relate that to a number, you push a button in an elevator, you get out, and you have to do the thing in reverse, and then, God forbid, it's not there, because the librarian has taken it and put it elsewhere into their fiefdom. The proposal in reverse was, let's take the librarian out of the system, let's take all these confusing classifications out of the system, and let's simply organize books by Dewey Decimal number. And in an ideal situation, you would organize them going from 000 to 999 on a huge ribbon, and given the numbers of books we had to accommodate the growth for in downtown Seattle, that would be about 5 blocks. We didn't have 5 blocks, and so the solution was to build a parking structure that wrapped around the site, going up 4.5 floors. Now, when you go into that system, everything just uses the Dewey Decimal number. You get the Dewey Decimal number, you go into the elevator, the Dewey Decimal numbers are in the elevator, you push the button, there's no floor number, you come out of the elevator onto a floor, and into the spiral itself are the call numbers, and you just go up or down the spiral based on the Dewey number. And because of this, this building that had 273 full-time equivalents in the old building, which was a third the size, and was given 1 extra full-time equivalent, so 274 full-time equivalents. That's a term for staffing. Basically, they could, per week, use that number of people per month, per week, per month. This system allowed us to pull the staff out of the stacks themselves, so they were no longer navigators, no longer docents. The system could be self-navigated, and now we could create the mixing chamber. And those 2 ideas were the absolute core of the building in every possible way. And it was those 2 things that we defended at every last moment, but owner and architect alike throughout the process, both the process internally in terms of design and the public process in terms of engaging the public and engaging the design commission and so forth. Now, the second project I'm going to show is the Wyly Theater in Dallas. When we started this project in 2004, also an interesting situation. And it is, frankly, the picture is the first issue. 2004, the Dallas Theater Center, which is the resident company for the Wyly Theater, or for the, there's a operating entity which is now called the AT&T Performing Arts Center, and then there's a resident company. So the resident company, the Dallas Theater Center, was strangely a renowned theater company in Dallas. Renowned theater company in Dallas. That's the important thing. Why in Dallas? Theater isn't in Dallas. Theater, everyone knows, is in my hometown of Seattle, Chicago, and thankfully New York, where I now live. Never Dallas. Why Dallas? It made no sense whatsoever. Yet they were getting the best artistic directors, the best dramaturgs, the best scenic designers, the best actors coming to perform in that. That was a shed that was built in the late 50s that they had been performing in for almost 50 years. And what we discovered after watching the company for about 2 months is that because they were performing in this horrible little building, they could do whatever they wanted to it. So when they did a streetcar named Desire, they blew a hole through the side and let the motorcycle drive right in. When they did a cherry orchard, they dug a 30-foot hole right through the mat slab with a backhoe. People came out of a real hole. And it was because of that malleability of the building that they could get incredible actors and so forth to come perform here. Because if you had proposed to do something like that at the American Airlines Theater on Broadway, you'd be fired in a heartbeat. So as an architect, we were faced with a really difficult conundrum. If we gave them the edifice they wanted and they couldn't, it was precious, we would be responsible for killing the company that made this entire enterprise possible. So the first position was, don't do that, i.e., create a new building that was as malleable, as robust as the old one, but was somehow a brand new edifice. And the second was a nuance of the first. There was what's called a multiform theater company. That means they do one show in thrust, the next one in traverse, the next one in the round, the next one in proscenium, the next one in black box, and so forth. And for years, that was fine, because for years, labor and materials were cheap. And then starting in about the early 90s, we started to see an inversion. It used to be easy to raise money for operational budgets. When I was a kid, PBS used to be sponsored by First Boston. Is that right? Remember those, like PBS, and there was First Boston logo would come on. First Boston was happy to give millions of dollars to PBS just to sponsor the 1974 year. Well, no one wants to do that anymore. People want to give money to edifices. So you can raise capital costs, but you can't raise operational costs. And so over time, they started to no longer have the money to convert this horrible little shed into different configurations. And so at some point when they ran out of the money to do it, they had to fix it. And now the flexibility of this company was being jeopardized on two different fronts. And that was the moment that we came in. And so the second position was figure out a way to reapportion the capital costs, take a large chunk of it out of capital A architecture and move it to infrastructure so they could do these kinds of transformations at a push of a button without requiring additional operational budgets. Now, the solution was dumb. And for us, dumb is not a pejorative term. If something is dumb, we think we're sort of onto something. The idea was to take front of house and move it below house and back of house and move it above house. And at first, that might seem crazed. But the result was what we like to call Superfly. And the idea behind Superfly is to take all the freedoms associated with the fly tower and smear it out over the auditorium. That would allow you to take anything that was precious, from the proscenium to the balconies to the seats. Everything could be flown up, and the area that was remaining could be drilled, nailed, cut, painted, glued, and replaced at minimum cost. But there was a third benefit that we didn't expect. At least it wasn't one of the initial positions. That was, if you do this inversion, if you make a vertically stacked theater, suddenly the auditorium is entirely freed up, i.e., it gets put back into the hands of the artistic director to control suspension of disbelief. At what moment do I relate and stop relating my real life to what I'm seeing on stage? So with that, there's the building. That's the interior, and you can see this is with all of the blinds raised. These were the four configurations that we agreed with the client we had to be able to do. We had to be able to do it with 2 stagehands in 15 minutes. Proscenium, thrust, flat floor, and studio theater. Now, I talk a lot about flexibility, but over the years, we've taken a very different stance on flexibility than most. We believe that the most flexible things are situations in which you give a client a series of very high performance presets, not a generic space that they can theoretically do anything. Because when you have a generic space you can do anything, they'll do one thing and they'll never be able to afford to push it off center very far. There's not much flexibility at all. Great example, the Centre Pompidou. How many times have they changed it? 0. How much of the budget went into being able to transform the Centre Pompidou? About 42%. It's crazed. So this idea of providing presets, these are the presets. We could do all these with excellent acoustics, sight lines, and intimacy. But then we also looked at 4 other configurations. 2 are standard ones, arena and traverse, but we invented our own, bipolar and sandwich. Bipolar was mine. And the intent was to see how far, if we gave them these presets, could they actually push them off center and still be able to do something new with it? So we were constantly testing the efficiency and the clarity of the presets, but also undermining them to see how far off balance we could push them. This is the building in a proscenium, basically before it even opened. This was the first show. This was designed by us and the theater consultant. This was Henry IV, in which basically everything was moving, the balconies were moving, so there was almost nothing in its appropriate place. And this was the flat floor configuration. Flat floor configuration was extremely important also for revenue generation and also important to convincing the client to go an extra step to be able to do the flat floor configuration, precisely because now they can actually rent the venue out. And in process of renting the venue out with a fly tower, it is the place in Dallas to have the American Airlines Christmas dinner, to have bar mitzvahs, to have weddings, and so forth. And frankly, right now they're making more money per year renting the venue out than they used to make in the entire year selling tickets. Here you see the building. This is the first time we ever transformed it. I said it was 2 people in 15 minutes. You're going to see about 50 people in about 4 hours. We were trying to find stuff. We were having lunch. But nonetheless, you get the extent to which the environment can transform. While this is running, I'll say that we had 2 really interesting data points. The first is that it has tripled their audience. And the second is that, 3 data points. The second is that of the 25 performances that they have already done, or shows that they have done, they've done them in 20 unique configurations. So this idea of presets actually is bearing out to be highly flexible because there's only 4, and they've now somehow managed to do 20 different configurations with 4 presets. And then the third is that in the 4 years that the building has been finished, they have actually sent 7 shows to Broadway and off-Broadway, where in the 50 years before they had only sent 12 shows out of the theater at all, and all of them to regional theaters. Okay, so what was the other benefit? This was the thing that I said we didn't expect, this idea of giving suspension of disbelief back into the hands of the artistic director. This is the auditorium here. That is an STC 57 wall, i.e. that's basically the same as a box-in-a-box concrete construction. And what you're seeing is a trompe-l'oeil. That is not really a curtain. That is what looks like a curtain that's been printed onto vinyl curtains that are vinyl shades that are integrated into the acoustic wall. And of course, then they can lift. So you can do totally hermetic theater, but you can also open up the entirety of the auditorium at a push of a button. It takes about 15 seconds for them to raise. And that means now the artistic director, if he or she wants you to apply the parable that you were seeing at the end of Macbeth, he or she can do so, where you suddenly see Dallas. The person is taken out of their suspension of disbelief and now starts to apply this to the real life, or vice versa, right? There's different ways that they can use it. That transparency also had another advantage, which is that it started to allow, to build patronage by allowing people to see how theater was made, see them blocking scenography, see them making scenography, see them actually going through dress rehearsals. On any given day when it is nice in Dallas, which is not that often, you'll see families out here having evening picnics just watching the back of the auditorium. We took it yet a step further. You know, I talked about in the beginning of A Streetcar Named Desire. We also made the perimeter operable. So it's an STC 57 operable glass wall. That means that they can actually bring things directly into the auditorium in any place, and they can also break for intermissions directly outside of the auditorium. So in the end, what we provided them was this. We provided them not only a multi-form theater, but a multi-procession theater, right? So we could do proscenium thrust, flat floor, et cetera. But we could also do, it says episodic, processional, focal, and open, but you could also think of it as Wagnerian, contemporary, Renaissance, and Greek. So what ultimately, if we succeeded, did we provide them with? Well, we provided them a building that has our procession through it, and it has a lobby with little dangly lights if you like them. You go up through our stair up into your seat. But the artistic director can also script a Wagnerian sequence where you go directly, if anyone's been to Bayreuth, you go directly from outside into your seat. So here they can go directly from the outside into the seats, bypassing our lobby completely. And in the end, you can do this. You can have the first act arrive in Wagnerian style, first act in thrust, intermission in Greek, second act in arena, and then everyone departs through the sort of contemporary lobby that is ours. And there you see the building in situ. Okay, third and final project that's built before I go into things that we're working on now. And actually it's two projects, and one of them, it starts out as a sad story and it becomes a happy story. The sad story is very close to here, it's in Pasadena. In 2006, we started a commission for Caltech right after Morphosis started their commission, which is the astrophysics building. That was our site. As you know, Pasadena has amazing weather. It's also weirdly almost a perfect square of a campus. It takes about 15 minutes to walk from here to here. So there weren't a lot of problems. In fact, the only problem that we could find to get a hook into the project was that this was meant to be an interdisciplinary center in which they were taking someone from astrophysics who was a Nobel Prize winner and teaming them with a Nobel Prize winner who is an epidemiologist and putting them all in one place and to see what would happen. And that notion of a center we found would be sort of bizarre that it wasn't in the center of the campus. And honest to God, that was like the first and only hook we had for a long time. How are we going to get into the project? At some point, though, for various reasons, we developed this. It was a big horizontal plate with each professor having his or her entourage, and that entourage of postdocs and doctoral students and graduates and undergraduates, they could share and mutate and take more space and give back space. So we had this flexible plate, and all the recitation areas were the centralized core that went right through the center of it. It had a kind of cocoon on the outside because it was a material that Caltech was developing. They wanted us to use. We thought it would be cool to use, so it was like a big kind of worm cocoon. It was horribly ugly. We liked that. We went all the way through concept design. It was approved, and we were about to start schematic design. This is sort of the whole contractual thing will start to come up. Something not so unusual happened. They said, oh, by the way, the Pasadena Design Commission has to approve it. So, well, that would have been a good thing to know before we just spent 3.5 months doing concept design and you approved it. What does that mean? They said, well, if they don't approve it, you got to start over. Well, this is one of those gray areas. We're not really sure, is that our failure or is that their failure? And because you just started the project, you don't really want to say to the client now, hey, that's 3 months of additional services because you're pretty likely to get shit-canned at that moment. So you're kind of nervous. You're thinking, I'm going to have to design this myself at my own cost. I'm panicking, and we're trying to redesign it because when we took this to the design commission, guess what they said? It has to be Spanish style. Now, I'm in a panic. I go to the president of Caltech, who is also a Nobel Prize winner, much smarter than me, and I came to him with my great idea. I said, look, we don't know how to do Spanish style, but there are all kinds of architects in Pasadena who know how to do Spanish style. Why don't we do our kind of little cranky building, and then you have someone do a Spanish style box that will go around the outside of it. And he looked at me and kind of went like this, and he said, you know, you've been telling me for about 4 months now that constraints are opportunities. Isn't this just a great opportunity? Right? Don't ever try to bullshit someone who's smarter than you are. So another 3 weeks go by, and I'm really panicking, and then someone in our office came up with actually a genius observation. The problem wasn't the design. I need to show this slide first. Who knows what's happening here? Neo says, how do you bend the spoon? And what does the boy say? There is no spoon, right? what we realized is we were trying to solve the wrong problem. We were trying to redesign the building. Instead, what we should be doing is trying to redesign the Pasadena Design Commission. So with that in mind, we asked the head of PR and campus planning to put us on the agenda at the Pasadena Design Commission first on a day that they were going to review about 90 garage additions, all people pissed off because, of course, Pasadena is full of beautiful mid-century modern buildings that now have to have Spanish-style garage additions. And we walked in with 2 slides. And the first slide was this. And we said to the Design Commission, you know, look, over the 80 years that you have had purview over Caltech, you have indeed legislated Spanish style. You have done high modernist, you have done brutalist, you have done neo-modernist, and you have done bad. But what's interesting is the only thing you seem to manage to have legislated over 80 years is the color beige, and our building is beige, and so you should let us do it. Now, what we expected would happen happened, and that was a group about your size went into I told you I'm going to swear a lot, went into a complete shitstorm. Because they all went, wait a minute, you're right. Why do I have to do a Spanish-style garage on my mid-century modern house? And everyone started screaming, and we took our 2 slides and we left. And 3 weeks later, we got a letter, and it was sort of like a cease and desist letter. And it simply said, here's the deal, don't ever come back to us. You must do 3 things. You must do a building that is 3 stories, it must be austere, and it must have a ground floor arcade. Okay, we can do that. And so we did what we called the wolf in sheep's clothing building. And we took the building, sort of like, you know, a sea slug that wants to eat something, and went like that, and just inverted it, you know. And so we took the thing that was in the center, the kind of austere recitation area, and we made it all of the offices. And this was basically it was a motel, a post-tension concrete slab building. There were no finishes. It was concrete floor, concrete ceiling, fan coil units in the walls, so there was simply nothing, no ductwork, no anything. And it would blow over in a wind. And then on the interior of it, we took all of the more gregarious things, the recitation areas, and we made a braced frame. And that braced frame provided all the circulation as well as the stiffness, and this was steel. So we had a steel object inside of a concrete, very lightweight shell. And if you've all been paying attention in physics and your structures classes, if you want to increase stiffness, you fold something and that increases its moment of inertia. And the concept of a braced frame is that if you fold the plates and you have 2 folds per floor per face, you create something that is incredibly stiff. Now there was a second backstory to why we were doing this. There you see the building. This was the core in the center. And by the way, that was the material that Caltech was developing. The backstory is that when we presented this, now we're about 6-7 months in, and the last 4 had been at our cost, is we didn't want to spend a lot of time dickering on whether or not this met their desires or not. And so we presented it to them, and they started to say, yes, but can we move this circulation over here? And we said, no, it'll fall down. They said, come on, that can't be true. I said, no, it'll fall down. So they took it to their head of physics structure. They did analysis, and they came back and they said, it'll fall down. And so now we were in a position where it really was on their dime if they forced us to redesign. We met their ambitions, we met the program, the thing worked, we'd redesign it at our own cost, and so they kind of hedged and said, okay, go for it. And that was the result. And they would build it exactly as I described. They would have built the steel structure in the center, this kind of angry thing, and then they would build the lightweight post-tension concrete slab around the exterior. And it was 3 stories, austere with a ground floor arcade, and those things we defined within the Pasadena code as roof appurtenances. And that was it. Now, don't know if the next image, no. The sad part of the story is we were 2 weeks away from starting construction. Morpheus's astrophysics building had already started construction, and for whatever reason, the president left very suddenly, and the new president was a kind of curmudgeonly Frenchman. Not all Frenchmen are curmudgeonly, but this one particularly seemed to be. I don't know if he didn't like us, didn't like our design, didn't want to build anything of the previous president or any combination or permutation of the 3, but we got a letter that said basically, do never call us again, after we were literally 2 weeks away from groundbreaking. That was in the end of 2007. And that was it. It was done. We shelved it. That was the end of the story. Until 2 years later, Fashion Week in New York, this gentleman walked into our office and he came in on a Friday. So Fashion Week in New York is a full week. He showed up on Friday, and he showed up with Gisele Bündchen. And I looked at Gisele Bündchen. And he started to talk, and I looked at Gisele Bündchen. And he was Turkish, and I looked at Gisele Bündchen. And he said, my family has the preeminent fashion company in Turkey. We have our headquarters and office in a beautiful modernist building that my dad built in the 50s from a member of SCI-Arc, who was the architect. And the municipality has just told me on Monday of Fashion Week that they're going to destroy it in 9 months with eminent domain, so they can build a freeway off-ramp. And so I need, if that were to happen, our company is half privately owned with my family, half publicly owned. If that were to happen, our stock prices would crash. This was at the beginning of the worst of the economy, and he was scared his company would go under. So he said, I need to have a brand new, brilliant building. I'm not sure why he came to us, but building that I could actually release prior to them demolishing my dad's building. And so that instead of this being a reactive move, it'll be seen as proactive. And again, he said, I need to do this in 9 months. And I'm thinking, still I'm looking at Gisele Bündchen, but this is getting my attention because it's crazy. So, that's not really that possible to do capital A architecture. Frankly, it's not that possible to do much more than a lean-to in 9 months. And he said, no, don't worry about it. My cousin, who is my CFO, he just went out and he just purchased a building. And so, you just adaptively use that building. It's a structure from the 50s that never got completed. So it's just a big concrete shell, concrete bones, and you can just use that, right? That'll be fast. I'm thinking, now this guy really is crazy. Because that's going to be much slower and much more expensive, and I'm still looking at Gisele Bündchen. So I said, look, let's talk about this over dinner with Gisele. And that was on Friday night, so we had dinner, and during dinner, he showed me what his cousin had just purchased. I started to crack up. So after dinner, we went back to the office, and I showed him Caltech, and I said, do you like this project? He said, yeah, I really like it. I said, do you like it a lot? I said, yeah, I really like it. So on Sunday, we flew, without Gisele, we flew to Istanbul, and on Monday, we met with his engineers, and that was the building. And because it was also a motel, just sitting in the hills on the European side of the Bosphorus, it was basically exactly the same height, exactly the same floor to floor, exactly the same mechanical concept for servicing the rooms, except it was a funny U-shape. And so we spent some time with a structural engineer that day trying to figure out how to take that, which we knew nothing about, and transform it into that for which we had the construction documents. That was on Monday afternoon. On Tuesday, we negotiated a contract, and on Wednesday, they started construction. Using the construction documents now for the perimeter, but we're only halfway there, right? Caltech was a robust interior with a lightweight exterior. Here we had the opposite problem. We had an incredibly robust exterior, because in Turkey, labor and materials are still cheap, and so they just throw tons of rebar and concrete at it. They don't really worry that much about it, and no one had any drawings for the structure. We had no idea how it would react in an earthquake, and we had no time to do a forensic analysis of it. So the second half of the project was we had to figure out what would go into the center. And that center thing, whereas this was a robust concrete exterior, would have to be a lightweight steel interior. And the two would have to move independently because we'd never be able to figure out the periods, the earthquake responses of the two different systems because we didn't know how the concrete system would work. So the clock had started. We're 3 days in. In order to finish the building on schedule, we had to have the steel show up after 2 weeks. After 2 months, which means we had to order the steel, which is amazing, and they can do this in Turkey, after 2 weeks. So for the first 2 weeks, we took a page out of Seattle, and we started to just design a series of boxes. These were all the programmatic boxes that would go on the interior, but we designed them so that they could structurally be stacked on each other in any way, and their structural integrity would hold. And then we sent that to the mill order, sent out the mill order. And now we had 6 weeks, and we started to design. And the idea was take these boxes and rotate them like this and like this and like this so we could actually create the primary circulation because, of course, the first thing we did is we tore out all the circulation of the existing motel. And over the course of the next 6 weeks, we did this, tried every sort of thing we could think of. And when the steel showed up, we said, okay, build that one. We are now 2 months in. So they So this is the thing that effectively we designed, this kind of thing. You might like it, you might hate it. But there you see, this is the building as it's already been turned into a donut, and then sort of like Alien coming out of the belly of Cain was the big steel structure that we had designed. You guys really are, I mean, this is Hollywood, right? I'm making all these movie references for you and nothing, like crickets. They built it by taking a box. He rented the neighbor's property. You can see the clearing there. They would build a box, they would pick it up with a crane and dump it in. And so here you see this was the 5th box. There's the 6th box. There's the 7th box. And there's the 8th box. And they built the entire steel structure in 5 days. So we are now 2 months and 5 days in. And there, you know, what I didn't start out by saying is, what was the issue in the position? Well, here it was simple. Speed. That was it. That was the only issue, and the only position was get it done in time. And the beauty of it was, not only did it teach us how to think much more lively on our feet, but the sort of irony of when we would present something to Jem, the CEO, and he would start to go, I don't know if I like it. We'd just be like, you know, every minute you waste, Jem, is another minute you're not going to open. So taking you through the building, that's the library in the downstairs. There was a museum dedicated to his father who just passed away. This is the auditorium, so this is going from the basement up to the 1st level. You then use the roof of the auditorium to go from ground level up to, I guess, European, I don't know which one's first and which one's ground anymore. So ground up to 1st level, I'll say it that way. That's the 1st level you use. This is where they show, they're a fashion company that also produces very, very exquisite textiles. And so this is where they actually present the textiles to buyers, takes them up to the 2nd floor. Then you go through the meeting box there. These are where all the meeting rooms are, up to the 3rd floor, which is where the administration is, and that was Jem sitting. Now, full disclosure, we missed it by 2 months. We finished it in 13, not in 11. Now, the second half of this, well, first, so this was, again, the thing that we designed. This was the mirror glass thing that we got Jem to accept. These are real pictures. They're not photoshopped in any way. We told him we thought it was really beautiful, which we did, but there was also a kind of, in our minds, an irony that in a fashion house where you would have models all the day, you would have the vanity of replicating them 1,000,000 times through the building, which is something we never told the client. So there you see the thing that we designed. That was the wrapper around the outside. This is where probably one of the most interesting things in my career has ever happened, was to find a moment in time in which you can only do things in that one place. Essentially was, how are we going to clad this thing? There you see the building finished. Jem wanted us to clad it with something that said Vakko, right? And you know, so he kept saying, okay, I want something like Louis Vuitton or Coach, I want our logo on it. And we thought, you know, that's not really what we do, I don't know how to do this. And we came back to the original structure. That was the original structure. We thought, you know, we're never going to be able to hide this pig. It's always going to be present. And he was the first company in Turkey to be really focused on being a sustainable company. So he said, Jem, instead of trying to hide the fact that you're using an existing structure, why don't you celebrate it, right? Adaptive reuse is the most sustainable thing you could possibly do. So why don't we figure out a way to actually make the bones apparent as opposed to hide them, because we're never going to be able to hide them very well. And so that led to the notion of, can we make saran wrap, i.e. make something that is so thin that you see right through it and you see the original structure. Now going back to your structures classes, if you have just flat glass, it has to be quite thick. If you put a structural emollient around the primer, it can become thinner. But if you start to slump the ideal shape of the structure for the glass into the glass itself, you're effectively increasing its what? Its moment of inertia, right? So you're increasing its stiffness again. And so we simply started to slump into the glass its ideal structure. And why was an X the ideal structure? Because we didn't know how this external ring was going to react in an earthquake. And we were worried, of course, that it was going to rack like hell. And so the safest way to put the glass on without it exploding was to pin it at the top and let it hang like a true curtain wall and just kind of dangle in an earthquake. And to literally let it do this. Well, that meant that we had 2 pins at the top and 2 pins at the bottom, and the ideal structure was an X between them. The reason I said it was a beautiful moment in time is that Turkey, at that point, was going through its industrial revolution. And so it had both super high technology, because the Turkish contractors had all moved into Europe in the 80s and 90s, and they now had come back into Turkey in the 2000s, and they still had a craftsman class. So they could do things inexpensively there that you couldn't do anywhere else in the world. So they could make jigs that were incredibly precise, and we would destroy one every 3 pieces of glass, and they could make them at super low cost with incredible precision. And they also had the technology to selectively cool glass so that we could slump very, very precise shapes into that glass. So it's a marriage of these two things allowed us to create what we subsequently called Saran Wrap. Now this glass is 3/8 of an inch thick, and it is 5 feet by 9 feet tall, 10 feet tall. And there you see it in situ, and for you there is Giselle Bundchen. And there you see the interiors. And then the final building. And so it started with this, and 13 months later, it became that. All right, now I'm going to move into work that we're doing now, hopefully with the belief that as I show you certain things, even if they're crazy, even if you think it might be bullshit, you'll give me benefit of the doubt based on what you've seen. So the first project I'm going to talk about is actually something that really takes a page out of what we learned from the Wyly Theater, this idea of presets. This is the Future Lab for Mercedes-Benz. If you know anything about the UN Studio building, it sits here, that's their museum. This is Untertürkheim, that is Mercedes-Benz main plant and headquarters. This is what they call the centers, the Mercedes-Benz Museum, Mercedes-Benz Center. This is their biggest dealership in the world. And so on this site, directly next to their headquarters, they have their past and their present. And we were given the other half of the site in order to create a building that was dedicated to their future, through a very, very interesting observation of theirs, which is that they believed that only through making the future apparent, the myriad possibilities of the future, combined with their past, would anyone actually understand that Mercedes-Benz was actually at the forefront of mobility, that they were actually the state-of-the-art of mobility. And this is important for them economically, because right now, even though I truly believe that Mercedes-Benz is the most innovative car company, they're having their butts kicked by Audi and BMW because they are perceived as being more innovative. And so while this might seem strange, they truly believe that if they build a building and then they begin to program it, i.e. they make relationships with the MIT Media Lab and with ZKM and Karlsruhe, that in fact they will start to be able to have a programming that will reveal and create the future in a way that Mercedes-Benz will get the due credit that it deserves. That is their belief. We believe it because we're building the building. So there's the site that we were given, and we took 3 positions. So the question was, if the future and the past are actually the parents of the present, what is the appropriate response to the future? The first was, it had better be timeless. This is the Weissenhof-Siedelung Le Corbusier from 1927 in Stuttgart, sitting right in front of a Mercedes-Benz from 1927. So I hope you can see what the issue is. This is a car company that thinks of design in 7-year cycles. And so there was an incredible push to do something fashionable and new. We said, in fact, our entire pitch to them was, we don't know what the other 7 competitors are doing, but we bet it's cool. And you had better not do something cool. You better do something that's going to look just as good compared to what you did now in 100 years as this building does. That was the first position. And the second was to make a very specific contrast to Ben's building. Ben's building is a classic museum. It's very protective, hermetic, it's sort of a jewel box. And we wanted to create, therefore, something that was dangerous, changing, evolving, i.e. represented the future properly. Now, we very rarely talk in metaphor, but in this project, the issue of metaphor actually came up. This was truly insane, if you know anything about Germany, because Germany has, as its base energy code, you must effectively meet LEED Platinum. That's its base energy code. So imagine in Stuttgart or in Germany trying to do an entirely glass building, and I'll come back to that. So the second issue became a real problem. And the third had to do with curation. This is a portion of the museum. A museum, particularly this one in a theme museum, all that you have to do is figure out what to do to add this little bit, right? And then in another 20 years, they figure out how to add this little bit. That's the entire problem. But if you're doing a building that is dedicated to presenting the future, and the future is changing by the minute, you can't do that. So what do you do? What is the appropriate building in order to house the future? And our response was, again, learning from the Wyly Theater, give them a palette. Give them a palette of 3 very, very distinct environments, each one doing its own thing, each one having its own circulation, mechanical systems, and so forth, in a way also learning from Seattle. And then to allow one component to be able to change the other 2. And so the first component is what we call, it is the near future, which was part of the brief. The near future was a big horizontal 60-meter expanse. It has underfloor air distribution. It can handle heavy loads. It has a luminous ceiling. All these things were in deference to trying to create a highly, highly, highly flexible space. It obviously had, because it was glass around the entire perimeter, views out over the entire campus, and it had a linear circulation, which is important to them because the near future were the things that they have, but they don't want to necessarily put them in hierarchy. So making a round building allowed them to present them with interconnection, but not with hierarchy. The floor beneath, now this is the tricky one. This is the far future. How does a company whose most protected secrets are its future innovations create a building dedicated to the future and actually express the far future? They couldn't actually answer the question. And so in our proposal, we said, why don't you effectively start to make it more like a stage? And so within this space, we exposed the ceiling and made it lower. We started to propose a lot of the infrastructure that we had used in the Wyly Theater so that they could in fact stage mise en scène, cultural productions, art, et cetera, that would present both past visions of mobility in the future as well as current visions of mobility in the future. Because they can't present their own visions of mobility because they'd be giving away their secrets. And then the third, this one had a major and a minor axis. It was also a 5-square grid, so while the upper one has one linear circulation, this one the curators can basically demise arms and create in that 5-square grid any kind of circulation amongst the arms. And then the third thing is what we've called the future core. And this was actually our position to them. And we were the ones who proposed, you need to start making relationships with MIT and ZKM and so forth. You need to be able to, in this building, hold dialogue, debate. You need to be able to create the future on the spot. That's how you will get legitimacy as a company that is innovative. If you are seen as sponsoring discussions on energy or water shortage or population control, that in your building in which you're also displaying innovative pieces of mobility that are sustainable. And so this core that you can't see at all because of the projector, my apologies, had a series of, so it sort of could be a contemplative environment and a debate environment, but it had three simple elements that change. Importance that they were incredibly simple, so they're fail-safe and that they will work for the next 100 years. The roof is basically a theatrical rigging, so they can suspend new forms of technology. They can also suspend incredibly heavy objects. The second are two circular media screens that can lift, basically pointing at different areas, so it can actually start to be part of this idea of engaging or cutting off different arms or different portions of the near future. And they can also lift entirely, and they can create different combinations and permutations. And then last but not least, a true stage floor, so that they can create a sort of viewing hill, they can create a debate chamber, they can create a true kind of debate chamber. And those three things now allow this central element here to mediate the two others, to decide when the near future will infect the far future, create what they call future moments, and when the reverse will happen. And so if I take you through the building, the intent was to keep the building incredibly dumb in terms of circulation. Foyer, something that we call the future garage, I'll describe it in a second. Near future, far future, and then back out. Totally dumb, anybody can do it. All the circulation is by this paternoster element with the future garage. So they put all of their prototype cars that they're developing, and they're in constant rotation. And that movement introduces the visitor to see where all the elevators are in the grand stair. And that also is the means by which they deliver vehicles and exhibits. So a tour through the building, you come down Mercedez-Strasse, you see this kind of combination of the protective museum and the very transparent and indeterminate future lab. Enter the campus plaza, go into the foyer, and this is that moment they said you see the paternoster constantly rotating. And that introduces you to sort of prepare for what you will find above. You go up above into the near future. Within the near future, you can see how the media screens can start to go from a sort of contemplative environment to a debate environment to a display environment, down to the far future, the same thing, contemplative environment, debate environment. In this case, the auditorium also opens up to participate in the debate chamber, and then also open up completely, and then the future core itself to go from a contemplative environment to a debate chamber, just simply display of a large object. All right, and then back down to the at grade, there was also this desire for the building to have a kind of, they want to actually start moving all the presentations of their new vehicles into the building. And so this idea that they could actually use the lobby, not just for a lobby for the museum, but also to extend it and have the auditorium open up into this grand space that moved through the entire base of the building. So there you see a section through the building, the long section, going through its different phases, and then the auditorium could sometimes be used, the upper portion, as part of the debate chamber, can also be used for the display of cars, lectures, and also eventually just to open up. Right, so effectively, like the Wyly, this is what we're giving them, a palette. And we don't know how they're going to use it. And frankly, they don't even really even have an exhibition designer, let alone any concept of what the exhibits are, because by the time the building's finished, the exhibits they would be thinking of now will be already obsolete. No, you're not going to be able to see this at all. All right, so now I'm just going to show you a picture. This is how we responded to dealing with German energy code. I have always had a suspicion about moving parts in buildings, even after the Wyly Theater. And what we're discovering now is that certain things, we can see the interior is moving, that is starting for us to become a bit of a trope. But what's weird is I actually am starting to believe it. That may be a bad thing. But we're also seeing the idea of movement, and I'm going to show a series of projects in which this has become a real theme for our office. Why? Because even you can even create an entirely glass building if you recognize that the sun is dumb, right? The sun, if you hold your hand in front of it, it doesn't know as it's moving that you're moving with it, right? So it doesn't know that everything else is transparent. And so with this building, we have a programmed curtain. It's a sort of high-tech curtain. It's silver on the outside and it's black on the inside, so you can see straight through it. It morphs from being more opaque towards the south and more transparent to the north. When you have overcast days, it must be fully deployed in order to combat glare. But on sunny days, it literally just moves around the building with the sun. And it's not rotating, it's simply selectively deploying. So it will last for 100 years. We can warranty it for 30 years. It's very sort of direct, sort of blind condition. And of course, it can lift entirely, and then there you see it at night. All right. So now with this notion of moving, I'm going to just go through several more projects quite quickly, most of them with the notion of movement. And that could become a theme of critique. We'll see in a second. This is I can't say where it is, but it is basically a stock exchange. If you look closely in the picture, you'll be able to tell where it is. Two interesting things about the project. The first is it's in a Muslim country, and the second is it's on the equator. And those are the two things that generated the design, believe it or not. We were asked to create what they called a profit machine. They wanted something that was simply perfect. It had exactly the right dimension of the core, exactly the right dimension of office space off the core, to be sub-partitioned into various kinds of configurations. They could subdivide it into 2, they could subdivide it into 4, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, because they were going to rent this out to the financial sector. And starting with what Mies and SOM sort of proved to the world of architecture in the 50s, this notion of a tall tower that you subdivide the mechanical points. Why? Does anyone know why you do that? Guys are such a quiet crowd. Just yell it out. Because what it means is that you're servicing up and down from interstitial points, which means the core can be smaller. When the core is smaller, you can put more meat on the bone, right? That's money. So developers want thin bones. Well, the observation was, if we can do that, we should also do it with people. And so we created, why? Similarly, so we could reduce the numbers of elevators into the core, so we didn't have to incredibly increase the dimension of the core. Now, why would we have to increase the core of an 80-story building in a Muslim country? Because people have to go to pray 5 times a day. And how do you get the occupants, all the occupants of an 80-story building, out to an exterior prayer area and back up into the building 15 minutes, probably 3 times during the workday, without adding 40 elevators, which was basically what we were being asked to do. You can imagine the dimension of the core, and you have this little bit of meat around the exterior. And so using the same idea, applying, it's probably not a great metaphor, but applying the notion of mechanical services to the movement of people, we created interstitial prayer floors through the building. And then the second revelation to us was, in the equator, the sun is on both the north and the south side of the building. One thing I will say is that when we first released this project, we had all these people writing to us on our website saying, "You stupid idiots, don't you know that the sun comes from the south?" And you're like, I mean, are we as a culture that myopic that we've never been to Australia where the sun comes from the north? Do we not know physics that much that we don't understand that? So on the equator, of course, the sun moves all the way around the building. Well, that means that you can actually create a single strategy to sun response. And we created a veil, and that veil similar to we were doing, in fact, this project came earlier, but same kind of concept, a silver exterior and a black interior, so that from the interior you see through it. And this has to do with optical studies that 3M did in the 90s. When they did all this, they wanted to sell stuff that you put on the sides of buses, and so they figured out all those dot matrices. And what they realized is that your brain gets tricked by black. Your brain doesn't really process black. And so even if your brain sees as little as 4% through a screen that is black, as long as it's in an appropriate dimension of pixels, your brain will fill the rest of it in. And that's why all the buses that you see have this 3M film on it. Well, the same thing can apply to buildings. So there you see the building with what we'll call the prophet floors, and then the prayer floors. The prayer floors were necessarily larger. So how could we combine these two ideas? We simply stretched a retractable combination. Basically, it's a PTFE skin, but not a soft one. It's actually semi-rigid, a little bit different from some of the other things that we've been exploring. So there you see it actually comes in like scales. And it would go from the prayer floors down to the narrower floors. And so it couldn't be entirely rigid. We had to have Teflon battens. So as these things either contracted downwards or contracted upwards, they would be able to curve inward. And that created the kind of elegant fluting on the side of the building, which you can't really see at all in that picture. And of course, then they would gang up one under another, almost like scales, because they were rigid and not soft. So they're not ganging up like a true curtain. We'll skip over the details because you can't see them. So there you see the building, and you can see the kind of ghost. We made a huge mistake when we first presented it because we called it a veil. And of course, immediately there was a discussion as to whether or not there was a really horrible metaphor of a woman's veil and taking off her veil. So we just started calling it the sunshade very quickly. But there you see from the interior, where you can see actually these are the wires that are allowing the sunshade to gang, and then it disappears in the evening. So part of the reason that the disappearance was so important, obviously, is that in the evening, if you have a semi-opaque surface, well, it is semi-opaque, but you can see through it because of what happens with your brain. But in the evening, when the light goes down and there's interior lights, it will just become solid. And so we had to be able to remove it from about 5 o'clock onward. Why? Because this was a financial building, and they were going to have people in this building trading 24 hours a day. And you couldn't just simply say to the people who were working from 5 at night to 5 in the morning, too bad, you don't get to see anything, just so that you can have a highly sustainable building. So here, this was the end result. Now I'm going to start launching into a whole bunch of, the next project may not be it. I think I've left the, okay, that doesn't have moving parts. And after this, 2 more projects, if we can, unless you guys are sort of hit your limit. I can do one more and stop, or I can show, I should at least show this one and a second one. This is a project for a very wealthy gentleman who has 4 children, and he's very close to his children. And he came to us with only 4 requirements. You could say he already came to us with the positions. The first is that he did not want a compound. He wanted a building that he and all of his 4 children and their future families could live in a single structure. I guess that's actually sort of 2 positions. Second is, or third, is that he wanted the building to look like it had always been there. That's a little dangerous for us. And then the third was that he wanted a big, what he called a double grand American stair, which I think is actually an Italianate stair, not an American stair. So as a diagram, effectively, that's what he was asking for, a structure that he could live in which his house actually had all of the ancillary and amenity spaces, and that embedded into that would be the houses of his children. Now, I got to know his eldest daughter quite quickly, and there are several tensions going on. The first is that she said, look, there's no way in hell we're going to go live with her dad. So now we sort of have 2 clients. Right? We have the client who's paying us, and we have the clients who are eventually going to use the building. And the second is that of the 4 children, 3 of them are under 18. So we're being asked to build 4,000 square foot houses for children who have no idea what they're going to be, what their family is going to be, if they're going to have a family, how they're going to live. And that became the core of the challenge. This was the program that we developed. He had no program. He just said it must be 35,000 square feet. So we went through and we looked at 10 different 35,000 square foot houses for rich people, and we developed our own program. That was his house. There's the 4 kids' houses. That's the public space for the kids' houses. Sorry, that's the sleeping areas, kids' public areas, and then his public areas, understanding that he would have things like a screening room and a pool and a gym and a spa and a hammam and so forth. And our first act was to take them and kind of go into an ABA situation. There's his house, and then amenity, children's house, amenity, children's house, amenity, children's house, amenity, and so forth. And then we just looped it. And in this, the moment we had this, we started to call it the necklace residence. If I stick it on site, now I have to tell you where the site is. It's in Long Island. It is the point that F. Scott Fitzgerald claimed the Great Gatsby lived on. It is the most beautiful piece of property I've ever seen in my life, with panoramic views out over Oyster Bay and Lloyd Harbor. I don't know how much he paid for it, but I suspect it's in the order of $100 million, and that included the house that he's about to tear down to build our house. But you see the concept of his residence and then the amenity spaces in which then the 4 children's houses were, like a necklace. And the site is remarkable not only because of the view, so half the site looks out over Long Island Sound, but the other site looks into, and so there's a very steep bluff, it goes down this way and it goes down this way, and it looks into, or really has to go into, the oldest growth forest on Long Island. So there you see actually the section through the building. And what's interesting is that there used to be a 3-story, or is currently a Victorian house from 1912. But the new zoning doesn't allow us to do that. It forces us to do nothing more than 25 feet from bottom to top. And the site, before it starts to slope down, isn't big enough to put a 35,000 square foot house. So the only thing we could do is to take it and actually have it go out into the woods, which is actually fantastic that the code required us to do it. So we actually didn't have to convince him of it. And then if you were to x-ray the house, this was our response to the fact that his children were not of age. Is to say, okay, we'll develop this house with you, we'll develop this house with your daughter who is 33, but we're going to make a palette, an array of very different kinds of houses with the hope that if your kids are forced to live with you, they will have a house that they will more likely gravitate to than the other. And if they don't live with you, they will have, the dream of the summer home. You can pick 4 different kinds of summer homes, different kinds of living, some in the woods, some half in the woods, some on the beach, and so forth. Right? So that became the plan of the building. And then to address his last desire, which was, I want it to look like it's always been there, and that sounded a lot like he wanted a much bigger Victorian house. There you see it in the site. As we said, why don't we make it look like it has never been there? So we just wrapped the entire thing in police glass, one-way mirror glass, which has also had the amazing repercussion of when we took it, the opposite reaction to the Design Commission in Pasadena. When we've taken this to the Design Commission in Lloyd Harbor, everyone kind of looks at it and says, oh, you don't see it, and they walk away. There's no issue. So all the neighbors who are super wealthy that we thought were going to tear us apart kind of went, that was it. So again, you can see we have this sort of weird predilection for chrome and mirror. Again, the client got excited by it, I think more than anything because it simply means the 2 years of risk in which we would have to go through the approvals process just evaporated because of the design. And then on the interior, it's entirely transparent. And contrary to what you might expect, they want nothing impeding the views into each of the houses. So the family will be able to see each other eating dinner and their living rooms through each one of the houses. And there is also the requirement within the event space that is there to be able to put a table for 40. And then this was our reaction to the grand American double stair, that you had to get up to the roof, so we made this sort of bizarre winding, unfortunately we call it the tapeworm in the office, tapeworm that gets you up, but it also then doubles as a kind of viewing platform for events. And there you see it. And now, I think these drawings, I was going to show you the drawings in the current state, but they're going to be almost illegible. But at least if you squint, you can sort of see how the typologies are developing. We call that the pinwheel. This is the binary house. This is the punch house. This is the shotgun house. And this is the plus house. And there's the actual plan. Okay. Last story, unless you guys can actually sit through another one. This one, I promise, is funny. Does anyone know what this building is? This is the Nasher Sculpture Garden in Dallas. It was a gift from Ray Nasher to the city of Dallas. It has an extraordinary sculpture collection. It was designed by Renzo Piano, and its roof here is, according to Ray Nasher and Renzo Piano, the single most important piece of sculpture in the building. Why? Because Piano and Arup devised this kind of egg carton, I guess that's the right way of saying it, light baffle system that only allows true due north light into the building, which is great because it has natural light always streaming into the building in an incredibly sort of unpleasant climate, the sun is obviously beating down in Dallas. And everything is fantastic except for one, and I can't even say oversight, one little problem, which is that was finished in 2004, and that was finished last year, exactly due north of the Nasher Sculpture Garden. Now, so that's what's happening there. And you may have seen discussion of this. Has been called the ant bully, the kid that is constantly burning the ants. So in the media, the Nashers really played this up, that this is the ant bully. And they've had James Turrell write nasty letters and actually close his Turrell sculpture in the park and so forth. The problem is it's not quite so easy to blame the developer, because one, the developer, that was an as-of-right development. It went through the Design Commission and is fully zoning compliant. The only thing they did that was not so great is they made it a sort of lozenge-shaped building, which meant not only does it shine into the building, it actually does it at every moment of every day of the year because it's an inverted lens. The reason I say the Nasher isn't really, or that they are also culpable, is that what we knew when we heard about this is the Itzazaki master plan that was done in 1984. And if you look at where the sculpture garden, the sculpture park is here, there's zoned a museum, and as you can see, there are as-of-right towers that are not just 40, but 60 stories towers due north of the building. So Nasher and Piano knew damn well that someone owned those and that they were going to develop them. So now they're in a Mexican standoff. Perfect way to finish, probably. They're in a Mexican standoff because the developer is as of right, but they're baking the shit out of the sculpture. The sculpture garden is closing down, and it's the most valued kind of possession of the city. And to make it all worse, the investment behind the developer is the Dallas Police and Fire Pension Fund. So everybody's screwed. And we were asked by one of the parties involved, and I won't say which one, who knew us from the Wyly Theater, who said, basically, can you scare the shit out of these people because they're not talking? So for about a year, they're threatening to sue each other, and no one's doing anything, and it's getting worse and worse and worse, and it actually started to make national media. It was in the New York Times, it was in the Wall Street Journal, and it's starting to really embarrass Dallas. So our whole entry onto the scene was, I'll go back, right? See what the next picture is. Okay, is effectively this. They sit right next to each other. They can't do anything, their position is we can't do anything to our building because this is a building based on pre-sales. We pre-sold it with great views. If we now went in, we're not even sure we could put an exterior brise-soleil, but even if we did, you'd be covering up these $4 million apartments and everyone will bail. So in fact, they did the economic analysis. It would basically lose around $140 million, which means the project would not be financially possible, even though it's finished being built. And then Nasher says, hey, wait, these oculi are the most important thing, and on Ray Nasher's deathbed, he said that that was the most important piece of sculpture in the building, and so no one will do anything. And the only place you could do, if you're not going to touch this building or this building, was the city owns the street rights between the two buildings. And so we were asked, again, to scare them by proposing what was the third option. Now, the only thing you can do, understanding that this is almost 600 feet tall, and this is 1 story tall, and they sit right next to each other, is to put some form of plane that mediates between them. And that plane cannot be reflective in any possible way, because otherwise you would just repeat the problem. And we then started to map, this is showing 3 o'clock, of every day of the year. And you can see that the building is actually faceted. So as the sun hits it and goes away, what you're seeing are actually the facets going away in space. So we mapped the reflection of the sun on every day of the year on every hour. And so here it is going on the solstice every point of every day, of the day. And that led to a shape that was like this. Now, can you hold it up in the air? Yes, you can hold it up in the air because we know from the London Eye, and there's a parking lot right there that the city owns. The city said, put the structure there. We can lean it out like the London Eye and it will work. So it's a huge, massive bicycle wheel, just like the London Eye. That bicycle wheel takes the exact shape it needs to be, the minimum shape in order to block the sun. Now, how do we block the sun? Well, it can't be a permanent thing, because if it's a permanent thing, you've got $4 million apartments that have a thing standing in front of it all day long, and again, they'll lose their funding, and people will kick out their pre-sales, and the thing will go bankrupt again. And so we developed, or I shouldn't say developed, we ripped off these massive, beautiful, extending canopies that are over the Alhambra Mosque. Right? And when the sun comes out, they cover the entirety. The only thing is that we had to invert it, right? So we had to make an inverted parasol. That was a traditional parasol. We had to make an inverted parasol that could deal with compression and suction. And so this would, during the course of the day, tracking the sun, simply blossom and then pull away, so at any given moment, you would cover only the minimum amount necessary to keep the sun from hitting the building and then coming into the Nasher Sculpture Garden. And so the result then was that. Oop. And when we presented it, as I said, we literally came to the mediation session and presented it, and we thought, and it was deathly quiet, kind of like you all have been. And we thought that was it. Okay, they're scared. They're finally talked to each other. And I was asked to go outside of the room, and I waited for about 45 minutes to an hour. And then the gentleman who asked me to participate in this came out ashen, and he said, they think it's great. So the city of Dallas is currently trying to find $40 million for it. I don't know if that's a good thing. Honestly, I don't. Like, I mean, all I can say is that in Dallas, make no small plans. So now, it's very late, so I won't show the last couple of projects. But why don't we open it up to questions, if you want to. Do you want to turn the lights up?